The moment that changed everything did not come during battle. It came inside the wire, in full view of the prisoners. By early March 1945, American POW camps across Western Europe were operating at capacity. Thousands of German officers and enlisted men were arriving weekly as Allied forces crossed the Rhine. The camps were crowded tents and under strain. Supply lines were stretched. Guards worked long hours. Fatigue sharpened tempers. It was under these conditions that the system faced its most revealing test. At a temporary holding camp near the Rhine, a dispute broke out during evening roll call. A German officer, exhausted and ill, stepped out of line to speak with a medic. An American guard shouted an order. The officer hesitated, not in defiance, but confusion. The guard struck him with the butt of a rifle. The sound carried. Within seconds, the camp froze. Other guards turned. German officers watched closely, expecting what usually followed such moments. Escalation, shouting, perhaps further blows. Instead, the response came from the American side. A senior non-commissioned officer stepped forward immediately. The guard was ordered to lower his weapon. The German officer was escorted to the medical tent. Names were taken. Witnesses were identified. The roll call resumed in silence. That night, word spread quickly through the compound. The striking was not ignored. It was not excused as battlefield stress. It was not justified as discipline. The following morning, the guard did not report for duty. German officers observed what happened next with growing disbelief. An investigation was conducted openly. Statements were recorded. The camp commander addressed the prisoners briefly, not to apologize, but to clarify procedure. Violence against prisoners, he stated, violated standing orders. The matter had been referred up the chain of command. Within days, the guard was removed from POW duty. His reassignment was confirmed. The consequences were real. For German officers, this was a decisive moment. Until then, many had assumed that American restraint was conditional, maintained while convenient, abandoned under pressure. What they witnessed contradicted that belief. The system corrected itself. More unsettling still was what the Americans did not do. They did not publicize the punishment as a moral display. They did not seek gratitude. The process was procedural, quiet, and final. For prisoners trained to understand authority, this mattered more than speeches ever could. The message was unmistakable. The rules were enforced even when violated by Americans themselves. In the days that followed, behavior inside the camp shifted. German officers became more cooperative during inspections. Disputes declined. The atmosphere changed from guarded hostility to controlled compliance, not because the prisoners trusted the Americans, but because they understood them. This was not an army that reacted. It was an army that regulated itself. That understanding spread as prisoners were transferred between camps. Stories traveled faster than official notices. Officers compared notes. The same pattern appeared again and again. Rules applied without exception. Discipline enforced without emotion. By the time many German officers reached long-term camps in France or prepared for transport to the United States, the shock had settled into something closer to acceptance. They were not at the mercy of guards. They were subject to a system. And that system, they now realized, was stronger than anger. But the full impact of this realization would only become clear as captivity extended beyond weeks into months. When German officers discovered that American adherence to Geneva rules was not limited to moments of scrutiny or crisis, but sustained to the long, uneventful passage of time. It was there, as weeks turned into months. The reality of American rule inside the camps became unavoidable. The initial shock of restraint gave way to something more unsettling for German officers. Permanence. Daily routines solidified. Roll calls followed fixed schedules. Work details were assigned according to rank and physical condition, as required by the Geneva Convention. Officers were exempt from manual labor. Enlisted men compensated with camp-issued tokens. Medical inspections occurred without request. Mail arrived with predictable regularity. Red Cross visits continued, announced and unannounced. There were no sudden changes. 4 German officers trained to wait for systems to crack under strain. This endurance mattered more than the earlier disciplinary incident. Armies could behave correctly for a day or a week. Very few sustained that behavior indefinitely, especially after uncovering the full scale of enemy crimes. Yet the Americans did. The discipline held through bad news from the front. It held through reports of massacres in camps liberated in the East. It held through Germany's collapse, city by city, unit by unit. It even held after Adolf Hitler's death in April 1945, when rage and exhaustion swept through Allied ranks. Inside the camps, nothing changed. German officers noted that American guards did not celebrate defeat inside the wire. There were no triumphal gestures, no humiliation rituals, no symbolic punishments. Victory was expressed elsewhere on maps and briefings, in orders moving forward. Captivity remained administrative. This consistency reshaped the internal dynamics of the German officer corps. Senior officers resumed enforcing discipline among their own men, as permitted by the convention. Camp life organized itself around routine rather than resistance. Educational lectures appeared. Informal classes formed. Officers debated the future in guarded tones. The Americans allowed it. From a control standpoint, this approach proved effective. Escape attempts declined sharply. Violence within camps remained rare. Intelligence officers noted increased cooperation during interrogations, not through coercion, but through inevitability. Prisoners spoke not because they were threatened, but because the system left little room for illusion. The psychological turning point was complete. For many German officers, this experience forced a reckoning. The war they had been taught to fight, a war unconstrained by law when necessity demanded, had met an opponent that rejected that premise. The Americans demonstrated that victory and legality were not incompatible. This realization was deeply uncomfortable. It undermined long-held justifications. It weakened post-war defenses already forming in the minds of captured officers. If the Americans could adhere to international law while advancing across a devastated continent, then violations elsewhere could no longer be explained away as unavoidable. The contrast was impossible to escape. By the summer of 1945, as large numbers of German officers were transported to camps in the United States, the pattern continued unchanged. Camps in Texas, Arizona, and the Midwest followed the same regulations as those in Europe. Food was adequate. Housing met standards. Discipline remained procedural. German officers arrived expecting deterioration. They found replication. The message followed them across the Atlantic. This was not theater. It was doctrine. When the war officially ended in May 1945, captivity did not become harsher. It became more methodical. Demobilization plans were drawn. Repatriation schedules discussed. Records finalized. The Americans were already thinking beyond the wire. For German officers watching from within, the turning point was complete. The rules had outlasted the fighting. They had survived victory. And in doing so, they reshaped the balance of power inside captivity, not through force, but through legitimacy. That legitimacy would carry consequences far beyond the camps, influencing how the war would be judged, how responsibility would be assigned, and how history itself will record the conduct of those who claimed victory. Those consequences would emerge fully only after the guns fell silent. When the fighting ended in Europe, captivity did not. For hundreds of thousands of German officers and soldiers, the months that followed became prolonged tests of whether American restraint had been a wartime posture or a permanent commitment. The answer arrived quietly in unchanged routines. Across U.S.-run camps in Europe and North America, procedures continued as before. Food allocations were adjusted to peacetime supply levels, but remained adequate. Medical care expanded rather than contracted. As shortages eased, Red Cross inspections intensified, not diminished. Records were finalized with care, not haste. German officers took note. Many had expected that, with the enemy defeated, protections would loosen. Instead, enforcement tightened. American commanders understood that the post-war period carried its own risks. Frustration, boredom, and uncertainty could destabilize camps. Discipline, both for prisoners and guards, became more important, not less. Violations were still investigated. Guards were still rotated. Training continued. Inside the camps, order held. The effects were measurable. Reports from military police units showed low rates of violence and escape attempts. Incidents of retaliation were rare. Prisoners complied with regulations, not because they feared punishment, but because the system left no incentive to challenge it. German officers began to correspond openly with families, informing them of their treatment. Letters passed through censors, but the tone was consistent. Conditions were strict but lawful. Life was controlled but predictable. These letters traveled back to a shattered Germany. For a civilian population facing shortages, displacement, and occupation, the knowledge that captured soldiers were alive, fed, and medically treated mattered. It softened the psychological collapse of defeat. It also reinforced a reality that German officers inside the camps had already accepted. The Americans were not improvising justice. They were administering it. American authorities were aware of this effect. They did not suppress it. At the same time, U.S. legal officers compiled records detailing camp operations, disciplinary actions, and compliance with international law. These documents would later become part of broader Allied efforts to document wartime conduct, both their own and that of the defeated Axis powers. German officers understood the significance. Many had legal training. They knew that documentation was power. As preparations began for war crimes trials, this contrast became increasingly important. American adherence to the Geneva Convention provided moral and legal ground from which accusations could be made without immediate counterclaim. It did not erase Allied bombing campaigns or controversial decisions, but strengthened the legitimacy of Allied institutions. Inside the camps, the psychological hierarchy had shifted completely. German officers were no longer negotiating survival. They were preparing for judgment. Educational programs were introduced, often supervised, but not censored beyond security limits. Discussions of democracy, law, and governance occurred quietly. Attendance was voluntary. Resistance was minimal. The Americans allowed prisoners to think. This approach unsettled some German officers more than coercion would have. It stripped away the narrative of victimhood and replaced it with responsibility. In a controlled environment governed by rules, excuses lost their force. By late 1945, as repatriation plans progressed, many officers realized that their captivity had become part of a larger process, not punishment, but transition. The war had ended on the battlefield. Inside the wire, something else was beginning. That transition would shape how former enemies returned home, and how they would later explain the war. As 1945 progressed, the consequences of strict American adherence to the Geneva Convention extended far beyond the immediate control of POW camps. For German officers, captivity became a lens through which they viewed both defeat and responsibility. The predictable, lawful treatment they experienced shaped their understanding of authority, accountability, and the potential for order even in chaos. Repatriation planning highlighted the systemic nature of American policy. Prisoners were assigned to transport ships in order of rank and health, with medical staff supervising departures. Manifest records ensured that officers, enlisted men, and civilians moved in organized groups, maintaining security without resorting to force. Even during transit, discipline and routine prevailed. Roll calls, meal schedules, and sleeping arrangements mirrored camp procedures. The contrast with Axis treatment of Allied prisoners was striking. Reports compiled by returning prisoners confirmed that wherever the Germans had applied discretion instead of regulation, disorder and suffering had proliferated. Starvation, violence, and arbitrary punishment had been the norm. American compliance with the Geneva Convention now served as a silent indictment of those failures. German officers could not ignore the demonstration of institutional integrity, and it left a lasting impression. The broader implications extended to post-war trials. Documentation of strict adherence became evidence not only of American discipline, but also of adherence to international law. Camp records, inspection reports, and disciplinary proceedings formed a legal framework demonstrating that the U.S. treated prisoners humanely, even when the enemy had not. This credibility proved invaluable during tribunals and in the post-war reconstruction of international norms. Within the camps, the psychological impact on German officers persisted. Routine replaced tension. Compliance replaced resistance. Conversations shifted from defiance to analysis as officers debated what the American system revealed about military organization, governance, and morality. The law had become both a shield and a tool, protecting prisoners while asserting control. This influence carried forward into post-war Germany. Officers who returned home often recounted not only the material conditions of captivity, but also the organizational principles that governed their treatment. For some, these lessons informed local governance, occupational administration, or military planning in the years to come. They had observed a system where rules, rather than personalities, determined outcomes, a concept alien to the fluid hierarchy of wartime Germany. By the end of 1945, it was clear that strict adherence to Geneva rules had achieved more than humane treatment. It had reshaped perception, enforced order without coercion, and established a moral and procedural benchmark that endured in historical memory. The psychological power of restraint, documented and consistent, became as significant as any weapon on the battlefield. For German officers, the shock they felt upon arrival evolved into acknowledgement. Victory without law was brittle. Discipline with law was enduring. The American approach also influenced the wider Allied narrative. Reports of orderly camps, Red Cross compliance, and predictable treatment circulated through press releases and internal communications. It contrasted sharply with the Axis's variable enforcement and ideological cruelties, reinforcing the legitimacy of the Allied position in the post-war world. In the shadow of destruction, the law became a testament to authority. Through these months, German officers understood that captivity had been more than survival. It had been a demonstration. The war could end violently, but the power of law and organization could extend beyond battlefields. What they had first interpreted as unlikely restraint was in truth a deliberate strategy to maintain order, assert moral authority, and prepare for the post-war era with credibility intact. The implications were profound. By adhering to Geneva rules consistently, the U.S. had achieved a strategic victory within captivity itself, one that would shape the officer perception of defeat, the narrative of the war, and the standard of conduct expected in the international arena for decades to come. The story of German officers shocked by American adherence to Geneva rules is not one of heroism or cruelty. It is a story of order, law, and enduring discipline. It demonstrates that power in war is not measured solely by firepower, tactics, or numbers, but by the ability to maintain structure when emotion, chaos, and vengeance tempt deviation. For the officers who witnessed it, the lesson was clear. Authority is amplified when bound by consistent rules. The shock they initially felt was not born of kindness, but of predictability. The Americans had transformed law into a tool of control, demonstrating that restraint can wield a different kind of power, a power that outlasts battle, survives surrender, and shapes the memory of defeat. The camps themselves became microcosms of order. Meals, medical care, inspections, and punishments were not acts of generosity, but of system. For the German officers, the realization was unavoidable. They were no longer negotiating survival through fear or influence, but responding to an unyielding framework. That framework, disciplined and methodical, commanded compliance more effectively than intimidation ever could. Historically, this episode illuminates a broader truth about warfare and humanity. Victory is not defined only by the battlefield, but by the structures and principles a nation upholds in victory. By adhering strictly to international law, the United States demonstrated that it could win decisively while preserving a standard of conduct, a standard that would later underpin post-war justice, influence military doctrine, and establish moral credibility in a world seeking order from chaos. For the German officers, the shock of captivity left an indelible mark. It revealed a model of authority that combined legality, discipline, and foresight. It exposed the limits of ideology and improvisation, and it set a precedent that even in total war, law can endure, shaping both the immediate environment and the historical judgment of those who wield it. In the quiet confines of POW camps, far from the battlefield, victory and restraint coexisted. The Americans did not flaunt it. They did not seek acknowledgement. They enforced it methodically, and in doing so, redefined what it meant to command, to capture, and ultimately, to win.